Hi everyone! Today I want to talk about how to determine reality, that the world around us is real using only logical reasoning. One of the things that many theists argue is that without God, without knowledge of God, you cannot know anything. The Chovens use this argument a lot. Other philosophers use this argument as well. René Descartes being the best example of a prominent philosopher that uses the argument that without God, without the knowledge of God, you cannot know anything. Well, what I'm trying to do, what I'm attempt to do with this video is to demonstrate that you can, with logic alone, demonstrate beyond reasonable doubt that the world around us is real. Before going through that though, I think it's important for me to explain how to use logic, the different types of logic that we use and why do we use logic. Now, I don't want to do a very dry technical video here, so I'm gonna go through these explanations through an example. So before going through the example, let's talk about logic a little. The reason why we use logic is to predict things about the world. We use logical reasoning as a way to not so much understand reality, it is to understand reality, but most importantly, to be able to safely interact with the real world. We know by experience, by empirical data, that things behave in a certain way. And that's why we use logic, to be able to interact with the world, to predict what is going to happen as we are interacting with matter. Now, to go through to the example that I want to use here to explain the different types of method, which is inductive, deductive, and abductive reasoning, is a crime example. So let's here imagine that you are a crime investigator, you are a homicide detective, and there was a homicide. A woman was found dead in an abandoned lot, whatever. Now you go to the scene and you look at the body of this woman and you see that she has stab wounds. And you also see that she has signs of sexual assault. So in this case, you can, through inductive reasoning, conclude that this is a rape murder case. Why? Because in most cases where you see someone dead with someone dead, in this case with stab wounds, but you see someone dead with signs of sexual intercourse, is most likely a case of rape murder. Now, the most likely thing here is important, which shows that this is a case of inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning works on probability. You use past experiences, and with that gather experience, you can make a prediction that is not necessarily true, but is most likely true. In this case, it's most likely that this is a rape murder. Other thing you can induce by looking at a rape murder case is that your suspect is a male. In rape murder cases, in most cases, your suspect is a male. Now, there is a possibility that your suspect is intersex or is transgender, but is very unlikely. Your suspect, in this case, you assume that it is a male because this is what inductive reasoning tells you. Now, this is inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning deals with probability. Now, after you have that, let's say that also you find in this crime scene, you also find a knife. Now, you can determine that this knife is the knife used in the crime based on blood sample. Now, let's say that there is a lot of blood in this knife. It's in a crime scene. There is a lot of blood in it. and you test that blood, and you find out that the blood sample in the knife belongs to the victim. The DNA, the blood DNA on a knife, the DNA on the blood on a knife matches the DNA of your victim. That means that this blood belongs to the victim. This is something that you know through deductive reasoning. Now, deductive reasoning creates a general creates a general premise, then is going to look at an individual case and then make a conclusion that is necessarily true. Now, when we're talking here about DNA, the general premise that we have here is that all DNA samples are unique to an individual, meaning two people don't have the same DNA, except they are twin brothers or sisters. They don't have the same DNA. DNA is unique to the individual. In this case, the DNA in the blood sample belongs to your victim. So, therefore, the DNA in the knife belongs to the victim, and this is by determining the DNA, you can conclude that this is your murder weapon. Now, let's say you also find fingerprint in the knife. Now, with that fingerprint, you can do a search on your database, and then let's say it matches some man, which becomes your suspect, because again, you can use deductive reasoning, similar to DNA, that a fingerprint, or each individual has unique fingerprint, and if this fingerprint matches this person, means that this person was holding this knife that you have already determined is your murder weapon. So, going again to the next evidence, which is the semen found on the rape test kit done with this victim. You do a DNA test again, and let's say the DNA of the semen matches this same person. Now, with this, you established very well that the DNA and the fingerprint match your suspect. You have a suspect. With this information, fingerprints and DNA that we understand to be unique to the individual, you can conclude that this suspect is the perpetrator. But before we go to that, there are a few things that need to be told. Now, DNA works on probability. So the quality of your DNA sample is very important to determine probability. If it's, let's say, the probability of this DNA sample belonging to this person is 1 in 10,000, and the population of this hypothetical town is 5 million, this is a pretty bad sample. This is a pretty bad DNA evidence, because the possibility of being someone else living in the city is very, very large, and this is just one city. If you're talking about the population of the country, it's even more likely to be another person. So this is not a very good evidence. But if you're talking about a probability of 1 in 9 billion, that means that there is no other person in the planet that could have contributed to that DNA sample except your suspect. This is very important. Another thing here to consider is the probability of other person who is not a twin have the same DNA. This never happened, but we cannot know with absolutely certainty that two different people cannot have the same DNA. It never happened. If it happened, it would change everything we know about DNA. But there is always a little probability. So when you do your deduction to say that this person is the assailant, in this case, he is the killer, there is always a little probability of falsehood. So you use the set of principles, the set of premises to establish the link of your suspect with the crime, but this is what it's called abductive reasoning, because even though your evidence is extremely good, is beyond reasonable doubt, there is still a small probability of this person not be your criminal. This would change everything we know about things, but this little probability always exists. So when you're talking about deducting, in this case, a murder case, or you were talking about deducting a disease, making a diagnosis of a disease, there is always a little probability of mistake. And that's why, for example, DNA works on probability. Other possibility is there an alien race that has DNA, and then there is an alien with the same DNA as our suspect, and the alien committed a crime. Very unlikely. Or someone cloned our suspect and his clone committed a crime. Very unlikely, but it's not it is a possibility in the realms of possibilities. Now going back to the case that I propose in this video, the main purpose of this video. The foundation that we have based on logic must observe the criteria of skepticism, especially the criteria designed by Descartes. Why this is important? Well, because if you are open to every probability, you will never be certain of anything. So skepticism is the starting from the default position where everything is false. Now Descartes has 4 precepts to start any investigation about anything. So the first precept that Descartes established in his discourse on the method is to accept nothing as true before careful examination. The only exception to that are things that are self-evident. For example, blue is not yellow. That is a self-evident truth. A square is not a circle. This is self-evident. You don't need to examine that because one thing cannot be another thing at the same. In this case, a geometric form cannot be another geometric form at the same time. It can only be one. One color cannot be another color at the same time. There might be different hues, there might be combinations of colors, but then it becomes another color. Color, let's not forget, is only a classification of how we perceive light. The second precept is divide a problem in as many parts as possible and establish an order for solving each part from the simplest to the most complex, which is, of course, the process of reasoning, especially of abductive reasoning, when you create a set of principles, a set of premises, and then you find a conclusion. Now the third one is proceed on solving each problem at a time, always observing that established principles and axioms are capable of solving the next problem without incurring into logical inconsistencies or fallacies. So it's important to keep so we're talking here about a set of premises. Now it's important, if you're going to find something, if you are wanting to deduct to get to a good conclusion about anything, that each one of your premises is both valid and sound. Soundness, as we always have to remember, comes from falsifiability. So for a premise to be sound, you need evidence. You need empirical evidence to determine that your premise is indeed true, which is a process of deducting. The fourth precept is make general enumerations encasing the entireness of your conclusions, then test the capacity of your conclusions to solve real life problems. Now this is something very, very similar to what we have as the scientific method, where you create a hypothesis based on logical reasoning and then you start testing your hypothesis to see if it can predict good results. After you can predict a very large number of results consistently, then you know that your hypothesis is indeed good, is true, or most likely true, because it is a process of abduction, and as a process of abduction it always works on probability. Now, how do we determine then, using all this information, using this method, how do we determine that the world around us is real? The only thing that we know with absolute certainty is that our self is real. Now, this is a self-evident truth. The capability of thinking, being a thinking agent, is a self-evident truth that you are real. The very capability of questioning your existence is a self-evident demonstration that you are real. This might seem a little bit counterintuitive, because intuition will tell us that we know we are real because we can interact with the world. That's what intuition is going to tell us. I know that I exist because I can interact with the world around me. But what if the world around me isn't real? What if I am stuck in a simulation? What if I'm stuck in a matrix? The very fact that I can think that I can question that maybe the world around me is a simulation, is an evidence that myself is real. Maybe my body isn't real, maybe my brain isn't real, but my self isn't real. My mind isn't real. My consciousness is real. Of course, that doesn't mean that consciousness can exist without a brain. This is not the argument that I'm making. I'm just saying that this is the only thing that you know with absolute certainty before you can start investigating the world. And that's what you're going to do next. Now, one important thing is that when we are born, we don't know much anything about anything. Our minds, our knowledge of the world is very, very, very limited. So the only way to know things is through experience. We know shapes, we know temperatures, we know tastes and smells through experience. We go on in the world and we keep testing. We keep testing to confirm what we have observed in the past. So I touch something solid, I can identify the appearance of something solid, and then I touch something again that looks solid to determine that it is solid. Same thing with a liquid. Same thing with temperature. I touch something hot, and then I can expect next time I touch something hot, I'm going to have the same feeling. And that's how you're going to start testing out in the world. You're going to start testing with sounds, with shapes, with smells, with colors, with everything. This is how you proceed in the world to gather your empirical evidence. So when we are kids and we are crawling around and touching things and getting hurt and etc., we are gathering evidence of the world around us. After we gather that evidence, we still don't know that it's true. We still don't know that we are stuck in a simulation. So we start observing other people. We start observing how other people react to the world. And we start observing that they make the same predictions that we do. That when we predict that something is hot, they also predict that something is hot. When we predict that something is solid, they also predict that something is solid. So let's say we are having dinner with friends. We can smell chicken. We can't see it. We can't taste it, but we can smell it. And we realize that everyone else in the table is smelling the same thing as you, and they're all predicting that you are having chicken for dinner. And then when you have really chicken for dinner, you know that all of you are having the same experience of the world. Now, we also know now, through neuroscience, that all these impulses that we get are stored in our brain, and all of this information that we gathered, all of this interpretation of signs that we get from our body are processed by our brains. So we know that this whole idea of consciousness comes from our brains. That makes you conclude beyond reasonable doubt that the world around you is real, because it's not only your experience, it's everyone else's experience is the same. You all can predict the same results. Does that does that mean that there isn't a simulation? That we are not stuck in a simulation? That is a probability. There is always a probability that this is the case, that we are stuck in a simulation, but there is no good reason to believe in that. And as the Cartesian method presupposes, accept nothing as true unless you have good evidence. This is one of the precepts established by the Cartesian method. So if you don't have evidence, and I'm talking here about empirical evidence because this is the only evidence you're gonna have, is empirical evidence. Any other evidence that you have is not sound. It's not a sound evidence because you cannot falsify it. The only evidence that you can falsify it is empirical evidence. So, with all this evidence gathered, you can conclude beyond reasonable doubt that the world is real. Now, it doesn't tell you anything about God. You don't need a God to do that. All you need to do is careful observation of the world and be observing that everyone else around you is predicting the same thing, is experiencing the same thing. I hope I have helped people to escape the fallacy of the need of a God to know anything. You can know the world is real simply by careful observation and application of the method. This doesn't tell you anything at all about God, and actually God is a proposition that doesn't provide any empirical data for you to verify it. So actually the God proposition is a proposition that is unsound and therefore cannot be accepted as true by the Cartesian or the scientific method as you apply it, because you need empirical evidence to determine the reality of the proposition that God is real. So thank you very much for making to the end of this video. Please subscribe if you liked it, this video. Check my other videos. Please leave a comment if you think I made a mistake or if you like the video, whatever. I don't really care much about like, dislike, but a comment is always very welcome, either to correct me if you think I'm wrong, or to add something that I might have forgotten during my explanations. So thank you again for watching and see you next time. Cheers.